They turned ground beef into survival, culture, and legacy, recipes passed down by Native American hands, now nearly erased from memory. Why were these Native American ground beef recipes never taught to us? What they held goes far beyond the plate. When it comes to the kind of food that could bring a whole community together, nothing beats a powwow taco skillet. Picture this: golden fry bread sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, layered with spiced ground beef, beans, and a sprinkle of sharp cheddar. It is hearty, it is filling, and it is the kind of thing you could smell from half a mile away at a summer fairground. The best part was how everyone had their own little twist. Some would add green chilies, others would pile on diced tomatoes and shredded lettuce. No matter how you stacked it, it was one of those meals where you needed both hands and a whole lot of napkins. It was a festival favorite that always found its way back to the dinner table at home, whether or not there was a real powwow happening. Trust me, once you tried it, no ordinary taco could ever compete. But if you thought the skillet was the ultimate party trick, wait until you see what folks were flipping onto backyard grills during family gatherings. Fry bread beef sliders were the secret weapon at backyard parties before sliders even became a restaurant thing. Imagine little puffs of fresh fry bread, split in half, stacked high with juicy ground beef, seasoned with a wild mix of herbs and just enough kick to make you take notice. These were not your fancy brioche bun sliders either. They had a rustic, crispy bite that somehow made the beef taste even beefier. Toss on a dollop of smoky sauce or a handful of pickled onions if you were feeling fancy, but honestly, nothing beat the classic: beef, fry bread, and maybe a thin slice of tomato if it was growing in the garden. It was the kind of food that got you running back to the table before the adults could claim the last one. You might think nothing could top biting into one of those crispy, steamy little bundles, but the next dish might just prove otherwise. Reservation-style ground beef and wild onion tacos were the kind of everyday magic that kept folks smiling even when times were tight. Ground beef was stretched thin, seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever wild onions could be foraged nearby. If you have never tasted wild onions, you are missing out. They hit somewhere between a chive and a spring onion, with this bold, peppery snap that made plain beef sing like a church choir. Wrapped up in soft tortillas or sometimes even more fry bread, they were simple, satisfying, and straight from the heart. This was not a meal that needed fancy cheese or salsa piled a mile high. It was pure, straight-talking flavor that left you licking your fingers and hoping there was just one more taco hiding somewhere on the plate. Now, if you think beef and onions are a match made in heaven, wait until you taste how a little bit of sage could turn a beef patty into something unforgettable. Sage-infused ground beef patties might sound like something you would find in a fancy restaurant today, but back then, it was just another stroke of pure homegrown genius. Sage was everywhere in the right parts of the country, and it did not cost a dime to pick some fresh sprigs. Mixed into ground beef with a little salt and a whole lot of care, the result was a smoky, savory patty that smelled so good cooking, you would swear it could make a grown man cry. Fried up in an old cast-iron pan until the edges were crispy and the middle stayed juicy, these patties were tossed onto plates with a scoop of beans, maybe some fried potatoes if you were lucky. They were not just filling, they were soul-satisfying. And once you tasted beef lifted up by wild sage, you would wonder why anyone ever bothered with plain salt and pepper again. Speaking of dishes that hit you right in the comfort zone, the next one was a staple at tables that needed stretching a meal just a little bit farther. Ground beef and cornmeal dumplings were a true lifesaver when money was tight, but stomachs were growling. The beef was browned up and simmered slow with a few onions and maybe a pinch of pepper. Then it was topped with dollops of cornmeal dough. When it steamed and cooked right over the beefy juices, the dumplings puffed up soft and tender, soaking up every bit of that rich, savory flavor. No one was counting calories back then. They were counting smiles around the dinner table, and these dumplings guaranteed a few extra ones. It was a dish that filled you up from the inside out, the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs in the best way possible. Even better, you could stretch a pound of beef to feed 6 or 7 people easy, which meant there was always enough for unexpected guests or seconds. If you thought that was the peak of stretching flavor and comfort, just wait until you hear about a casserole that captured everything good about ground beef and corn and wrapped it up in pure 1970s nostalgia. Nostalgic beef and sweet corn fry casserole was the dish that looked like a mess but tasted like a memory. Imagine browned ground beef bubbling under a thick layer of golden sweet corn kernels, all tied together with a few shakes of salt and pepper and a little bit of cream if you had it. Baked until the top got crispy and the edges turned caramel brown, it was the kind of casserole that made the whole house smell like comfort. In the 1970s, every family potluck or backyard gathering had at least one version of it, usually scribbled onto a crumpled index card or passed down by word of mouth. Sweet corn was cheap, beef was precious, and when you married the two together, you got a dish that somehow managed to feel luxurious, even when times were lean. The first spoonful always hit you with that sweet, salty magic, and before you knew it, you were scraping the sides of the pan for just one more bite. And if you thought this casserole was the gold standard of hearty, simple eats, just wait until you dive into a beef and hominy masterpiece that practically invented stick-to-your-ribs cooking. Smothered ground. Beef and hominy was the kind of meal that did not just fill your plate, it filled your soul. Ground beef cooked slow and easy, seasoned with just enough spice to keep things interesting, and then tossed together with hominy so tender it almost melted in your mouth. If you have never had hominy before, just picture corn but bigger, puffier, and somehow even more satisfying. When the juices from the beef soaked into every kernel, you got a dish that was buttery, savory, and rich enough to carry you through an entire winter's night. Families back then knew that when you needed a dinner that would power you through long days and longer nights, this was it. It was not fancy food, but it was food that made you feel like you were winning at life, even when the cupboards were looking bare. Now, if you thought beef and hominy could turn a plain night into something unforgettable, get ready to bite into a dish that brought every powwow to life with a little bit of crunch and a whole lot of heart. Crispy corn cakes. Stuffed with seasoned beef were one of those foods you could smell cooking before you even stepped into the event. Little golden discs sizzling in big iron skillets, stuffed to the brim with ground beef seasoned with paprika, onions, and a pinch of chili powder if you wanted to wake up your taste buds. The outside was crunchy and golden, the inside savory and juicy. It was a dance of textures that made you keep reaching for just one more. The trick was to keep the corn cakes thin enough that they crisped up, but thick enough to hold all that seasoned beef inside without falling apart. At powwows and fairs, you would see kids running around with one in each hand, faces smeared with beefy goodness, while the elders sat back and nodded approvingly. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it was the perfect food for big gatherings where nobody had time for forks and knives. And if you think crispy stuffed corn cakes sound irresistible, wait until you pull up a camp chair and hear about the kind of chili that made starry nights and crackling fires taste even better. Ground beef and heirloom. Bean chili was not just a dinner, it was a memory in a bowl. Picture a heavy pot hanging over a campfire filled with ground beef simmering alongside a rainbow of heirloom beans. Pinto beans, black beans, cranberry beans, all the ones your grandmother insisted were better than anything from a can. The beef gave it depth, the beans gave it body, and a handful of crushed wild herbs gave it a smoky aroma that floated through the night air. It was not the tongue-searing chili you find at competitions today either. This was smooth, mellow, and rich, made to be eaten with big hunks of bread or scooped right out of the pot with a wooden spoon. After a long day of work or a night under the stars, nothing tasted better. If you were lucky, there was always a second pot heating up for breakfast too, because good chili was not something you left behind. Now, if you thought a pot of campfire chili could make a night unforgettable, just wait until you see how a little cedar smoke could turn plain beef into backyard magic. Traditional cedar-smoked beef skewers were one of those dishes that proved you did not need 1,000 ingredients to create something unforgettable. Beef was marinated with just salt, pepper, and maybe a brush of honey if you were feeling wild, then threaded onto wooden sticks and slow roasted over cedar branches. The cedar smoke wrapped itself around the beef, sinking deep into every fiber, turning a simple skewer into a feast that could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. You would find folks gathered around fire pits, laughing and trading stories while keeping an eye on their skewers, turning them every so often to get that perfect even char. There was something about the smell of cedar smoke that felt like a hug from nature itself, especially when it meant that dinner was almost ready. Kids would sneak bites straight off the sticks, adults would pile them high on plates, and nobody ever left hungry. And if you thought cedar smoke could work miracles on plain beef, wait until you see how mustard greens and ground beef teamed up for one of the most overlooked flavor combos in history. Ground beef and wild mustard greens. Stir-fry was the kind of meal that showed up fast and disappeared even faster. This was not some high-end stir-fry piled with expensive sauces either. It was a down-home skillet sizzler made with ground beef cooked hot and fast, tossed with handfuls of peppery wild mustard greens, plucked fresh from wherever you could find them. Those greens had bite, real bite, and they gave the beef this sharp, earthy pop that plain old spinach could only dream of. A splash of vinegar, a sprinkle of salt, and maybe a little bacon grease if you had it lying around, and you had a dish that punched way above its weight. It was light enough for summer, hearty enough for winter, and cheap enough to keep families fed when money was just a rumor. Stir-fries like these were the ultimate in practical magic, a fast meal that felt like you had been planning it all day. And if you thought a pile of spicy greens and sizzling beef was as good as it gets, just wait until you bite into a crispy pocket filled with beef and roasted roots, the kind of thing Great-Grandma used to make when the nights got cold. Crispy fried beef and root vegetable pockets were not just dinner, they were survival disguised as a treat. Picture dough rolled thin, packed full of seasoned ground beef, diced carrots, sweet potatoes, and turnips, then folded tight and fried until golden and flaky. It was like the first generation of the hand pies everyone brags about today, only made from scratch, with love and whatever you had left in the root cellar. These little pockets were the ultimate grab-and-go meal before drive-thrus were even a thing. They stayed warm wrapped in cloth, perfect for long days in the fields or a chilly walk to the town market. Every bite was crispy outside, juicy and tender inside, with the sweet earthiness of the root veggies soaking up all the beefy flavor. Families would make dozens at a time and stash them away for later, if they managed to last that long. Now, if you think stuffing beef and veggies into a crispy golden package sounds brilliant, wait until you hear about the Sunday classic that brought sage, beef, and cornbread together into something that tasted a whole lot like home. Beef and sage cornbread bake was the kind of Sunday special that made you race home from church just to get first dibs. Ground beef browned up with onions and a heavy hand of fresh sage was tucked under a thick, buttery layer of cornbread batter, then baked until everything was bubbling and golden. The sage gave the beef this deep, woodsy flavor that wrapped around the sweet cornbread like a warm hug. You would walk into the kitchen, and the smell alone would tell you that it was going to be a good day. Plates were heaped high, smothered with gravy if you had a little extra energy, or eaten straight out of the pan if you just could not wait. This was the kind of dish that felt like a full holiday dinner, even if it was just an ordinary Sunday. You knew you were doing something right when every last crumb got scraped up by someone pretending they were just being polite. And if you thought beef and sage were a heavenly match in the oven, just wait until you see how beef, sunflower seeds, and a cast-iron skillet could team up for a dish so hearty it practically stood up and shook your hand. Vintage iron skillet beef and sunflower seed hash was the kind of meal that was built to last, just like the old cast-iron pans it was cooked in. Ground beef was browned until crispy on the edges, tossed with diced potatoes, onions, and handfuls of roasted sunflower seeds that added a nutty crunch you never knew you needed. It was the breakfast that kept farmers going until sunset and made kids think twice before saying they were still hungry. Skillet hash like this was not just convenient, it was genius. Everything cooked in one pan, nothing wasted, everything tasting like it had been kissed by the smoke and heat of a wood-burning stove. The sunflower seeds were the wild card, adding little bursts of flavor that turned an already great dish into something special. Some folks even tossed in a fried egg on top if they were feeling fancy. But even plain, it was a meal that tasted like hard work, fresh air, and good living. And if you think hash can fill you up and warm your soul, wait until you dive into a stew that turns ground beef and roasted pumpkin into the kind of harvest feast you will dream about. Ground beef and roasted pumpkin stew was proof that simple ingredients could make meals fit for kings, or at least tired farmers at the end of a long day. Chunks of roasted pumpkin, sweet and caramelized around the edges, were simmered slow with seasoned ground beef, a splash of broth, and whatever herbs were growing out back. The pumpkin melted just enough to thicken the stew without turning it to mush, giving every bite a natural sweetness that played perfectly against the savory beef. Ladled into big bowls and eaten with hunks of bread or thick corn cakes, it was a harvest meal through and through. The best part was how it changed depending on what you had. Sometimes wild herbs, sometimes a handful of dried berries thrown in for a tangy surprise. It was all about using what the earth gave you and making something unforgettable with it. And if you think beef and pumpkin make a strong team, just wait until you taste smoky ground beef laced with the wild kiss of mint and juniper berries. Smoky ground beef with wild mint and juniper berries might sound like something a fancy chef dreamed up, but long before it ever hit a white tablecloth, it was the food of survival and celebration. Ground beef was browned low and slow, then mixed with hand-picked wild mint leaves and crushed juniper berries, which gave it this cool, smoky bite that you could not fake with store-bought seasoning. The beef soaked up the woodsy flavors until every bite was like eating a piece of the forest itself. It was a dish that stuck with you, the kind of taste that did not just fill your belly, but rooted itself deep into your memory. Sometimes it was served with a simple flatbread, sometimes spooned over roasted squash or wild rice if you were lucky. If you think mint and juniper could breathe that much new life into a skillet of beef, wait until you see how good old-fashioned flint corn turned a humble shepherd's pie into a feast you would swear was touched by magic. Hearty ground beef and flint corn shepherd's pie was not just a dish, it was a statement. Ground beef seasoned with onions, garlic, and wild herbs formed the base, but the real star was the topping, a mash made from flint cornmeal instead of regular old potatoes. Flint corn, the rugged ancestor of sweet corn, had this deep, nutty flavor that took the whole pie to another level. It was a tough crop that thrived when nothing else would, which made it the perfect partner for a meal built to last. The top baked into a golden crust, just thick enough to crack when you spooned into it, revealing the juicy beef and rich gravy underneath. It was a shepherd's pie made for real shepherds. Sturdy, filling, and full of heart. And if you thought that was the peak of comfort food innovation, just wait until you hear about the fritters that brought sweet potatoes and beef together in a state fair dream you could actually carry in your hand. Ground beef and sweet potato fritters were the original fairground jackpot. Imagine rich, seasoned ground beef folded into a sweet potato batter, then fried up until the edges were crispy and golden. Every bite was this perfect balance of savory and sweet, crunchy and tender, like a county fair and your grandmother's kitchen teamed up for a once-in-a-lifetime collaboration. These fritters were cheap to make, easy to eat standing up, and good enough to make you chase the smell halfway across a dusty summer festival. It was the kind of food that made you forget about prize pigs and pie-eating contests for a minute and just stand there smiling like a fool. And if you think a fritter could stop you in your tracks, wait until you taste a skillet of beef simmered slow in a chokecherry reduction so rich and tangy it could turn a dusty prairie evening into something straight out of a storybook. Skillet beef and chokecherry reduction was pure frontier flavor in a cast-iron pan. Ground beef was browned up until the edges got that perfect crispy sear. Then it was bathed in a chokecherry sauce that hit every part of your tongue. Sweet, tart, smoky, and just a little wild. Chokecherries were the secret weapon of prairie kitchens, gathered from scrubby trees and boiled down into thick, glossy syrups that could turn the plainest meat into something you would remember for the rest of your life. When that sauce hit the beef, it clung to it like a second skin, soaking into every nook and cranny and making each bite better than the last. And if you thought beef and berries were an unbeatable team, just wait until you take a trip back to the school lunchrooms of old, where cornmeal-dusted beef patties ruled supreme and second helpings were a battleground. Cornmeal-dusted beef patties were the ultimate school lunch heroes back when cafeterias cooked meals from scratch and second helpings were won by speed and charm. Ground beef patties were seasoned simply: a little salt, a little pepper, maybe some onion powder if the lunch ladies were feeling generous, then dredged in cornmeal and fried until the outside got crispy and golden. It gave each patty a hearty crust that kept the juices locked inside, and biting into one was like getting a hug you could taste. Every kid had their own method of attack. Some piled everything into one glorious, messy stack. Others took slow, careful bites to make the moment last. And even though you knew there were better meals out there somewhere, none of them ever tasted quite like home the way these did. If you think that sounds like a trip back to better days, just wait until you hear about a skillet dish from the Great Lakes that blended beef, wild rice, and a little kitchen magic into pure homestyle glory. Ground beef and wild rice skillet was the kind of meal that tasted like a slow afternoon by a Great Lakes shoreline, where the only thing rushing was the wind through the trees. Ground beef was browned up good and hearty, then tossed with earthy wild rice, caramelized onions, and a pinch of sage or thyme if you were lucky enough to have it growing out back. Wild rice was not the fluffy white stuff either. It had a chew to it, a nutty richness that made even a simple meal feel special. Every forkful was a little bit of beef, a little bit of rice, and a whole lot of satisfaction. Served up with a slab of fry bread or a spoonful of stewed berries on the side, it was the kind of home-style dinner that made you forget about store shelves and remember what real food tasted like. And if you thought wild rice could steal the show, just wait until you get a taste of the Southwest spirit packed into a prickly pear and beef tostada that hits every note from smoky to sweet. Southwest ground beef and prickly pear tostadas were the edible postcards of the desert. Colorful, a little prickly, and totally unforgettable. Ground beef was seasoned with smoky chilies, cumin, and a squeeze of fresh lime piled high onto crisp tostada shells and crowned with a tangy prickly pear salsa that brought the whole thing to life. If you have never had prickly pear before, it tastes like watermelon, and bubblegum had a baby, with just enough tartness to keep you on your toes. It cut through the rich, savory beef like a song you cannot get out of your head. This was the kind of dish that made people rethink what leftovers could do, stretching a little beef a long way while making it feel like a party on a plate. And if you think a little cactus fruit can transform a simple meal, just wait until you grab a tin cup and sit by the fire for a rugged ragu packed with pine nuts and campfire charm. Campfire ground beef and pine nut ragu was the food of the wild-hearted, cooked under open skies and eaten with smoke still clinging to your clothes. Ground beef was browned over open flames, tossed with rough-chopped root vegetables, and a good handful of toasted pine nuts that added little pops of buttery crunch to every bite. There was no measuring, no recipe cards, just instincts, a big old pot, and whatever was growing nearby or tucked away in a leather pouch. Some folks stirred in a splash of bone broth, others just let the juices and sap from the piney air do the heavy lifting. And when it was finally done, thick and savory and just smoky enough to taste the journey, it was ladled out into whatever bowls or tin plates you had on hand, eaten fast because second helpings were not guaranteed. If you think a pine nut ragu can warm your bones, just wait until you sink your teeth into beef glazed with honey and tucked between golden bites of roasted acorn squash. Honey-glazed beef and roasted acorn medley was the kind of dinner that made you feel like you were living in the richest cabin on the mountain. Ground beef was browned until tender, glazed with a quick mix of wild honey and a splash of vinegar, then spooned over thick wedges of roasted acorn squash. The squash would caramelize around the edges, turning sweet and nutty, soaking up all those beefy, sticky drippings. Every forkful was this perfect mix of sweet, savory, and just a hint of tang, like nature itself was showing off. It was a harvest festival on a plate. No fancy ingredients needed, just a good hot oven and a little bit of patience. And if you thought honey and squash could make magic happen, just wait until you hear how ground beef and dried apples got folded into fry bread pockets tough enough to survive the Dust Bowl, but sweet enough to taste like hope itself. Ground beef and dried apple. Fry bread pockets were pure, stubborn survival tucked into golden handheld miracles. Ground beef seasoned with whatever was on hand, usually just salt, pepper, and maybe a little nutmeg if you had it, was folded into fry bread dough alongside chopped dried apples, then fried to a crisp, perfect finish. The apples would plump up inside the bread, their tart sweetness cutting through the savory beef like a memory of better days. These pockets were dust bowl food, meant to be portable, tough, and nourishing when nothing else was. If you think beef and dried apples sound strange together, just remember, when life gives you dust and sorrow, you bake something worth smiling over. And if you thought that was clever, wait until you hear about the casserole that paired beef, corn, and wild garlic butter in a way so good, it should have been framed and hung on the wall. Spiced beef and corn casserole with wild garlic butter was the kind of dish you could smell from the driveway, pulling you straight through the door like a cartoon character chasing a pie on a windowsill. Ground beef was cooked slow with a heavy sprinkle of cumin, paprika, and crushed red pepper, then layered thick with sweet corn kernels and baked into a bubbling golden dream. But the real secret weapon? Wild garlic butter. Made from foraged wild garlic or whatever scrappy greens you could get your hands on, it was melted right over the top before serving, sinking into every crack and corner. The butter softened the spice just enough to keep you going back for bite after bite, and it was not uncommon for folks to scrape the corners of the casserole dish clean with a crust of fry bread. And if you thought a little wild garlic could change the game like that, just wait until you wrap your hands around a stew so smoky and rich it practically dragged the 1980s back into your kitchen. Ground beef stew with hickory smoked potatoes was the flavor of comfort when comfort was in short supply. Ground beef was browned nice and slow, not rushed like today's microwave world, and then simmered with chunks of hickory smoked potatoes that tasted like they had been hanging out at a backyard barbecue all day long. The potatoes picked up every bit of beefy, smoky goodness until they practically melted into the stew, making every spoonful thicker, richer, and somehow even more comforting than the last. It was the kind of meal you made when you needed to fill every belly in the house without breaking the bank or spending the whole night hovering over the stove. And if you thought a simple stew could take you right back to the kitchen tables of the 1980s, just wait until you hear about the chili that turned strips of old-school beef jerky into a reservation-style legend with a brand-new twist. Reservation-style beef jerky chili was one of those dishes that proved you could teach an old dog new tricks, or at least make an old recipe sing a whole new song. Instead of fresh beef, cooks would start with homemade beef jerky, the tough, dried strips getting rehydrated slowly in a bubbling pot of tomatoes, beans, and roasted peppers. The jerky gave the chili a smoky, chewy backbone that regular ground beef just could not match. A big cast-iron pot of jerky chili could feed a whole crew and then some, and there was never a spoon left clean afterward. If you think that sounds like the ultimate use for a handful of old jerky, just wait until you hear about the roasted maize enchiladas that made even the most ordinary dinner feel like a lost celebration worth remembering. Ground beef and roasted maize. Enchiladas were not just a meal, they were an event. Ground beef seasoned with ancho chilies and garlic was tucked into soft tortillas made from roasted maize flour, rolled tight, and then smothered in a slow-cooked sauce that hit every note from smoky to sweet to just a little fiery. These were not the neon orange enchiladas you might find at a chain restaurant either. These were rustic, deeply flavored, and rich enough to make you forget your own name after the first bite. Served with a side of beans or a handful of fresh greens if you were feeling fancy, they were the kind of dinner that made everyone slow down and savor every bite. And if you thought roasted maize enchiladas could sweep you off your feet, just wait until you meet a dish where sage-scented beef meatballs find a new home sitting proud on a bed of buttery blue corn grits. Wild sage and beef meatballs over blue corn grits were the hidden treasure you never knew your kitchen needed. Ground beef was mixed with chopped wild sage, a little garlic, and just enough salt to bring everything together, then rolled into tight little meatballs and browned until crisp and sizzling. But the real magic happened when you set them down on a bed of soft, buttery blue corn grits. Grits so creamy and rich they could almost pass for dessert if they were not so good at holding all those beefy juices. The sage gave the meatballs this haunting, woodsy aroma that turned a simple supper into something that tasted like it had been whispered down through generations. Before European contact, a lot of Native American tribes had an incredible amount of access to wild tubers and roots. This was really true for potatoes, which had been domesticated in South America. They began to replace some root vegetables as a staple crop because of the sheer amount of utility. I mean, that's a cultural fact that holds true even now. Who can really deny the worth of a potato? Some days it feels like it's worth more than all the designers in your wardrobe. Native Americans also had an incredibly interesting way of preparing these potatoes. Frying them in bear fat is definitely something I haven't really thought of before. But then again, these people used to hunt bears semi-regularly, so I think we're on pretty different ends of the spectrum. The potatoes would be sliced and fried in bear fat on a flat stone over an open fire, and it would actually make for some extremely rich and crispy potatoes. Banana meatloaf is an incredibly practical recipe that emerged from times where frugality was almost as much of a virtue as cleanliness. Rationing, resourcefulness, and economic hardship were how everyone was getting by. And this was only more true during the worst parts of the Great Depression and World War II. Home cooks were forced to work with very few ingredients, and the typical banana meatloaf recipe was something that was very bare bones and required little prep work or elaborate lists of ingredients to create. All you needed for this was pork mixed with mashed ripe bananas. Throw in some breadcrumbs, which could be repurposed from stale bread, onions, which most people were already stocking up on or growing, and basic seasonings like pepper, nutmeg, and salt, and you had yourself a pretty all-right dish. The banana worked as a binder and a natural sweetener, and it would often work really well with Worcestershire sauce, believe it or not. It helped balance out the incredible sweetness of ripe bananas. This dish did particularly well in Hawaii, where it was appreciated for blending in with already existing preferences. In the 1960s, there was a rising demand for all sorts of experimentative casserole recipes. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue, because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though, because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Caviar blini, on the other hand, was something that was sitting at the top of the caviar hierarchy. Even beluga, ossetra, and sevruga caviar that had been imported straight from the Caspian Sea came up short in comparison. Plus, the prices here were insane. Depending on where you went, private club or Michelin-starred French restaurant, you could actually end up paying more than $200 per ounce, which would be the equivalent of paying over $1,000 for caviar. Now, luckily, there have been laws that have policed how much caviar we source. There have been environmental issues due to overfishing, but it is always something people associate with being filthy rich. You get this served with the nicest champagne any place has to offer, the nicest sides you've ever had, and you just feel like you're sitting on top of the world. More than the silky smooth texture and the all-too-vivid taste, the feeling of being filthy rich that this gives you is what keeps people coming back for more. I think this one might actually work better as a cool history fact, instead of a Saturday dinner you're investing in. But hey, trying new things is cool too. There's definitely nothing as new as a roasted prickly pear cactus for dinner, but to us, it's just an out-of-the-box idea. To them, it was a pretty standard dinner. In arid regions like the Southwest, where cactus growth was always something you would expect, both the pads and the fruit were always eaten. However, cactus on its own isn't exactly the most palatable thing, so roasting it would really help with that. They had a whole specific preparation process for the cactus too. The pads would be harvested when they were young and tender, and before that, they also become very full of fiber. This was good back then because it meant they could be full for a lot longer, and a lot of food and meal plans were designed for sustainability rather than just for the thrill of it. Still, removing the glochids, otherwise known as the spines of the cactus, was as painful as you could imagine. They had tricks for making it quicker, but it was a pain. Native Americans would usually burn off the spines over open flames, or they would scrape them off or cut them with knives. They would also boil them sometimes to loosen the spines. It's definitely one recipe that's really out there, right? Also, interestingly enough, the cacti had a lot of medicinal benefits, like an incredible amount of fiber, a lot of vitamin C, and intense hydration. One of those happened to beef and peanut butter casseroles, and before you exit the video, hear me out. Beef and peanut butter casserole is a fascinating example of how people can get really creative when the stakes are high. This is a dish that has its roots in Great Depression thrifting and ingenuity. If you think it sounds really unusual, you're right, but you're also probably only thinking about this from a flavor perspective instead of what it can do for your body. Most people realized that the protein potential of this was off the charts. It combined peanut butter, which was already carrying loads of the stuff with beef, and it was a meal that could be stretched out to feed an entire family. Plus, despite how we regularly associate peanut butter with sweeter confections, it's actually been something that's constantly thrown into savory recipes too. This was a casserole that emerged all the way in the 1930s or 1940s, but peaked in the 60s. And this was because it was only in those early decades that peanut butter even began to be commonly available in most people's homes. It's got a lot in common with some Thai peanut beef dishes too. Yikes! While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, Hog's head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. Pressed duck, or as the French call it, canard à la presse, is one of the most elaborate dishes you can get. Seriously, I don't know how many of you grew up watching cooking shows and food competitions, but you knew things were getting fancy as soon as somebody mentioned duck. Now, to top all that off, you're going to throw in an entire young duck, roast it, serve it with the glossiest sauce you've ever seen made from the duck's own juices, and throw on an entire show before serving it. This thing wasn't just something that looked like luxury from a first glance. It was something that screamed luxury with everything there was to observe about it. It was served in a duck press. The wine was fantastic and obviously far more expensive than a bottle has any right to be, and you literally had professional skill barriers with this dish. I'm serious. Basically, it was such a rare and difficult cut of meat to work with, and you couldn't just give it to any chef in your roster. You had to give it to the absolute best, ones who actually knew how to handle the exquisiteness of what they're doing. Although I'm making it sound like a real spectacle, some of it might be a bit too macabre for you though. Especially the part where they crush the carcass by your table so they can extract all the blood and bone marrow. Those were the juices that were emulsified to make the red wine sauce using duck stock. That, and a lot of the skill and import barriers that were common with this recipe, is why this dish fell out of menus as trends shifted away from ducks. But don't let that mislead you. It's still something that rich people pay quite a heavy amount of dollars for. Beef gelatin molds were an example of just how obsessed the 50s and 60s could be with gelatin-based dishes. Remember the way I talked about how aspics were really just the culmination of people's preference for gelatin dishes? This was one of the best recipes that came out of all that. It was considered elegant and practical, two things you rarely find in one recipe. The concept of meat in gelatin actually goes back to the medieval times, though. Meat jellies and aspics were used as a popular way of food preservation instead of refrigeration, which, well, was a few centuries of. In the 50s and 60s, while refrigeration was still becoming a national convenience, people started to experiment with beef gelatin. They were influenced by how popular Knox and Jell-O were becoming, and it made people want to try out other different things and see what they could do with their food too. Now, they were mostly an outdated preference by the time of the 80s and 70s because people just got over the hype. But while they were there, they were a pretty phenomenal way to have meat. It was an experience that really broadened people's horizons to what a savory dish could be. Hogging an entire hog for yourself was a great hobby for Native Americans. Wild boar roasts were a pretty common activity for Native Americans, but it wasn't something that they came up with. This was actually something they took from the Europeans for once. It was brought over to America by European explorers active during the 16th century. They brought it over in the Southwest, but native species began to spread over to the Southeast after continuous hunting. Tribes like the Creek and Seminole eventually adapted and began to incorporate boris into their diets as well, using their own traditional methods like roasting and pit cooking. The wild boars were really tough to hunt though, but they got pretty good at hunting them down too because of their experience with bows and spears. Some cool military facts. Now, they wouldn't eat the boars as soon as they got them. These were actually mostly preserved for the winter because of the massive amounts of meat they would give. Can you imagine Thanksgiving without your grandma's famous turkey roast? Well, back in the day, roast goose was the traditional holiday dish. It was cooked using dry heat with hot air enveloping it evenly on all sides. Now, this is a dish I can get behind. Juicy, crispy skin, tender meat, and a flavorful stuffing. What's not to love? This dish was normally served with plum sauce to augment its flavor. It was particularly popular in England, where it was often served with applesauce and bread sauce instead. In Guangdong and Hong Kong, roast goose was a variety of siu mei, or roasted meat dishes, within Cantonese cuisine. It was made by roasting geese with seasoning, often in a charcoal furnace at high temperatures. This dinner isn't common anymore, but with a little effort, you can still find fresh goose and recreate this classic dish at home. Perhaps it's time to give the good old goose a chance to shine again. Clay-baked fish is also something that's a bit unconventional because it doesn't really match up with anything we use today. It's a traditional cooking method that was used by several Native American tribes spread across the northern regions. A lot of places in North America were rich sources of fish, like the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. Back then, preserving moisture was its own separate issue and struggle, and this was a particularly widespread way of doing that. This method would help the fish retain most of its moisture while also sealing in all kinds of natural flavors, and the end result was a much more exciting dish. Now, this works with most kinds of fish, so it's not like there's some strict preference. You should just roll with what you like. If you want to be historically accurate, then the Chinook and Haida tribes were pretty fond of using salmon. Some tribes also used trout or catfish, but the idea was to prepare the entire fish while also leaving the scales intact. Why would they do this? It was all to help the fish be baked properly. You didn't want anything messing up the meat on the inside. Now, some tribes were also fond of stuffing their fish, but if that's a little much, you don't have to go the extra mile. Stuffed prune meatballs are a really good example of sweet savory cooking. This was something you would see commonly throughout both Europe and America, and that was doubly true if we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a dish that was a mix of prunes with one of 3 different kinds of meats. People would either use beef, pork, or veal. And after the meat had been softened to the point it could be shaped and pressed into a meatball, prunes would be stuffed inside them. Some people were a bit freakier than others and would shove an entire prune up there, but some would chop it first. While this might seem like an innovative idea, it's actually not all that new. Dried fruit and meat combinations, especially sweet and savory ones, are really old ideas. They go back all the way to several different cultures present in Europe. You'll find them in Scandinavian, British, Jewish, and German cultures, and if you go on over to Asia, you will still find many sweet and savory combinations. This was a dish that did really well in the 20th century, especially whenever there were Jewish holidays, but over time, the American palate started to settle down with what was familiar instead of stuff like this. It couldn't really last and compete with regular meatballs. Sautéed sweetbreads were basically just the thymus gland of the veal or lamb. which, yes, I know, this name qualifies for being a catfish. Veal sweetbreads were really common in fine dining circles, though. And what's more than that, they were actually the standard for good, tender meat. What was slightly annoying about them was the way they needed so much preparation just to be able to be cooked. Like, you had to blanch them, peel away all the membranes still stuck on there, soak it in cold water, and then press it before you could get to cooking it. By the 70s, though, America was so deeply entranced in French haute cuisine that these dishes just dominated the world of the elite, whether or not they were a headache to make. Plus, it's not like those guys ever made it themselves. These weren't just meant to be meals. They were meant to be experiences that used the medium of food, and that whole logic is a big part of why they call it fine dining. Most places made it with traditional French methods, but some like to throw in Escoffier-esque techniques in their preparation. Hamburger upside-down pie is really one that's for people who like to experiment with their food. It has a lot of practical thought put into it, but somebody clearly had a lot of fun making this. You take ground beef, and then you take the concept of a baked pie, and what do you get when you mix those two together? A layer of seasoned ground beef packed beautifully at the bottom of a baking dish, laden with onions, tomato sauce, biscuit crumbs, and a cornbread topping. This pie would be baked and then flipped upside down so the bottom layer of beef was the first thing you had, and it was filling enough to feed your entire family and then some. This dish was a part of resourceful home cooking, and it makes me agree with something I saw earlier. It said that being bored is actually good for you because it brings out your creativity. I think that people had so little to work with in these times that they were for once thinking genuinely outside of the box, and sometimes that led to some actual eureka moments, and other times it was fun, little interactive dishes like this. While it wasn't remembered much, it was still a pretty convenient meal that you could even freeze for later if you weren't feeling like eating it all in one go. Understandably, because this is a behemoth to take down on your own. If you're a fan of retro cooking, though, this is a good place to start. Those interesting casseroles don't just end with peanut. If you really want to do something for a big flat-out feast, though, there's just nothing better than some Native American-style spit-roasted turkey. Turkey was a major source of protein and food for indigenous peoples in the eastern woodlands. They had been used to preparing and handling turkey for generations. They even had the cleaning process down to a science. Also, the feathers of the bird were used for clothing, for arrows, so that they would fly faster, and for rituals. I think they had some pretty good Thanksgiving ideas a long while before it even became a thing. If you wanted to recreate this today, you should ideally use a wild turkey, but even a domestic one works well. Also, smoked paprika and wild onions, plus the sage and thyme. I also suggest keeping it authentic and going with some bear fat or walnut oil if you can. You would need to set up a rotisserie spit over an open fire if you can. The end result is this deeply flavorful turkey that's got this wonderfully crispy exterior on the outside, but a smoky taste and tender feel on the inside. It's really just a delight for any kind of big gathering or party, and it's not a dish you want to be missing out on. Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. Butter. Next on our list, we're going to be dealing with beef and grape casserole, which is an example of mid-century American cooking really leaving no stone unturned. It was a combination of flavors that was pretty unexpected. Most people think that this dish came out around the 1940s to the 1960s, and that makes sense. Fruit-based experimentation with your typical average Sunday meals was a lot more common. What was interesting was the influences for this dish. Swedish meatballs with lingonberries was another thing that was growing really popular as a recipe for home cooks, and a lot of Americans tried to come up with their own spin-offs of recipes like this. Typically, it had ground or cubed beef, and this was browned with onions. Then it would be combined with grape jelly or entire grapes, and a sauce would be made for the broth. Tomato paste or Worcestershire sauce would also go in this broth, and some versions also used canned mushroom soup and sour cream to help create a more velvety texture. While the dish was definitely really ambitious and set out to accomplish a lot of bold, difficult-to-work-with flavors, it ended up not really lasting past the 60s. It seems like that one decade was an isolated incident as far as casseroles were considered. Still, is this something you would like to try? Or do you like your grapes on a separate plate from your meat? Gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, imagine what it could do for us today. Mock turtle soup is something that I'm dead sure you would not have seen coming. See, it's something that came out of 18th century England as a substitute for real turtle soup, which, by the way, was insanely popular in these times. People used to actually consider it something of a delicacy. During the Georgian and Victorian eras, green turtle soup would have sea turtles in it, and it was an incredibly prized dish popular among the local aristocracy. Before you crack a nice little cutting-edge joke about how British cuisine is the strangest thing on the planet, this was also popular in American high society, and it's something that got us through the Depression. That's right, mock turtle soup was something that people would make as much as they could when real turtles weren't around or were too expensive. Now, real turtle meat is known for having an incredibly rich and gelatinous broth. The key to mock turtle soup was just to start with the head of a calf or an oxtail, boil it down with a blend of vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions, and a spice rub, and slow cooking it. Next, once all the natural collagen was extracted, people would usually add in wine or sherry or Madeira, and this was really common in traditional turtle soup. It replicates the texture of the actual turtle meat, and cooks would try very hard to get that down right. It's one of the most interesting pieces of mock food culture we have, and it shows how good people got at imitating different kinds of foods without the core ingredients. Bear meat might seem like something out of a survivalist's handbook, but it was once a prized delicacy in many cultures. The roast loin of bear was considered a special occasion dish, reserved for feasts and celebrations. This dish has deep roots in the culinary traditions of the early American settlers. As you can imagine, hunting a bear was a daunting task, so this meal was a reward for bravery. Apart from the hunting of the bears, this one wasn't complicated to whip up. All you needed was the loin, which is the tender strip of meat along the backbone, which was often roasted over an open fire. Now, this is one meaty dish. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to know why this one has vanished from our tables. I bet you're not up to the task of hunting a bear, are you? Native American preparations of stuffed roast duck usually included some common themes like wild rice, corn and beans, acorns, and nuts, but it varied region by region. What really makes this such a standout recipe for dinners is that it is quite literally an entire stuffed duck. This is also something you need such as minimal appliances for making. It can be its own little day, too. So, if you're feeling like calling a friend over and brushing up your cooking skills over the weekend, this might be a good idea. The stuffing is also not something you need to worry about too much because it's not that hard to make. In California and the Southwest, ground acorns and pine nuts had a long tradition of being thickened into stuffing, and this was usually for pies, but the Native Americans thought it was better with ducks. The use of berries and fruits is definitely something I'm not used to, though, and I don't think a lot of people are. Many tribes like the Cherokee and Lenape would use dried cranberries and choke cherries in a fair amount of recipes, but in terms of stuffed duck, it was always used to add a bit of an extra sweetness to it. I think the most difficult part of this might be just managing the bird, because Native Americans would roast the duck whole. This is obviously something we aren't really used to, but if you really want to get authentic with it, you should try cooking it over an open fire. This ensured a lot more even cooking, and the meat would get really tender on the inside, besides just having a slightly smokier flavor. And that's never a bad thing. Meat jello, or more commonly known as aspic, is one of the best creations to ever come out of Western culinary history. In this entire list, we have a growing pattern of people mixing gelatinous textures alongside sweet and savory flavors, and this dish was arguably the ultimate culmination of that entire trend. So aspic was actually something that people usually associated with fine dining. It was also used to encase these fancy poached meats, which were sometimes imported, plus the thing just looked really fancy. Starts to make sense when you think about it. The early 20th century saw it turning into more of a generalized thing, though. The bizarre evolution of meat jello was really defined by commercialized powdered gelatin and canned soups, which meant that home cooks now had all the tools they needed to make as many aspic-based wonders as they wanted. It's still pretty hot today, comparatively. Venison is one of the most common meats throughout all of history, so it's no surprise that the Native Americans have their own nutty take on it as well. In forests and grasslands, deer would usually thrive a lot more than what we're used to. There used to be, like, massive packs of them roaming around everywhere. Before the 20th century, also, the American chestnut tree was in its golden years. It was devastated later by regional hazards and blight. Chestnuts were something that were available all over eastern woodlands, so it was very easy to forage them and gather them for emergency situations. Venison was always a staple meat for all kinds of tribes, especially the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Algonquians. Deer was something that was respected by tribes for how much the animal would take care of them. It would give them hides for clothing, the sinew was used for tools, and the bones were used in medicinal broths and kept for trading or for hunting tools. The meat was also very flavorful and important for making pemmican, which was a superfood essential to the Native Americans. Venison was usually cut into cubes and put into a broth with roasted and peeled chestnuts. They would be fond of using Jerusalem artichokes, squash, and wild onions as well, so stock up on your root vegetables before trying this. Beef stuffed donuts are a really bizarre thing to think about. They actually have been a part of tradition for so long. What tradition, you might ask? Well, savory fried dough dishes have been pretty consistently popular across America, believe it or not. Just look at all the meat pies we have. Unlike today's sweet donuts topped with chocolate frosting and red velvet, though, these were a popular way to make some portable food that also filled you up. Different versions of meat-filled fried donuts looked like beef mixed with onions and garlic, or gravy, or even cheese on the inside. So why did something so good disappear? Well, it's just hard to keep up with all the different things the world had to offer. Pre-packaged donuts, frozen ones, ready-made baked goods, all of it meant that people were far less interested in doing basic home baking the usual. Nowadays even, if someone does want to get cooking, they usually think about something that can at least get a couple of views. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. And that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. If you have a favorite memory tied to a meal like these, share it with us in the comments. Give this video a like and hit subscribe so you never miss another trip down memory lane.